Once upon a time, there was a boy who loved to knit. It was said he could knit so fast his needles would spark and smoulder. It was said he could work in the pitch black of night without so much as a candle to see by and not drop a single stitch. It was said his work was perfect. But whilst his work came out neat and accurate, not a single of his uniform stitches out of place, he found something in them lacking. He yearned for something he couldn't quite put a name to. He sought out more and more complex patterns, more and more unusual yarns with which to make them. Word travelled all throughout the land of the beauty of the things he would make, carried on the shawls he would knit, and the loved ones he would gift them to lords and farmers, to fishwives and merchants alike. But when people speak, the spirits listen. They followed these stories back to their source to see for themselves. I don't think I ever saw my grandmother without her knitting needles. There's no other way for me to picture her. When I was younger, we would visit, and there she would be on her armchair throne, her knitting in her lap, her needles clicking out a metronome as she pulled the yarn from the basket at her feet and wove it into her work. She would hardly glance at it as she spoke to you. She had been knitting for so long that the knowledge had burrowed its way deep into her brain, a warm nest between blinking and her heartbeat. It seemed entirely natural to my child's mind that her hands would simply continue on working long after my granny had gone to bed. I was fascinated by it. How she could take nothing more than a long piece of string and without even seeming to pay attention, turn it into a cardigan for my mum, or a pair of socks for my grandpa, or a thick woolly hat with a pom-pom so I wouldn't catch my death playing out in their garden. My favourite was watching her make socks. It seemed so complicated, with 4 needles wielded like a magician to somehow make it work. How could it not be the coolest thing I had ever seen? One day, when I was still quite young, we went on one of our regular visits to my grandparents. When we arrived, there she was in her chair, her knitting a dark red jumper in her hands. She saw me, smiled, put it down, and leaned into her basket, from it pulling a present. A ball of bright yellow chunky yarn and a pair of plastic knitting needles of my very own. That afternoon, we sat together as she patiently taught me to cast on, repeating her instructions and offering gentle correction until I had 20 shaky stitches sat on my needle. I was going to make a scarf. It was tradition, in her family at least, that the first thing you make should be a nice, warm scarf. It was the first thing her mother had made, the first thing she had made, the first and only thing that my mother had made. It took our entire visit for me to cast on those stitches, working with the kind of solemn concentration that only a child can muster. It was a fine start, she told me, and meant that next time we could get to work on actually knitting the thing. She stowed it away in her basket, promising me to keep it safe until I was there again. For the next week, I thought of nothing else. I would examine every knit item I could get my hands on with a kind of intensity that would have been admirable had I understood even the first thing about what I was looking at. I would lie in bed, replaying over and over again in my mind exactly how I would cast on those stitches. Every morning when I woke up and when I got home from school, I would ask my mother how long we had until our next visit, the answer always seeming frustratingly far away. But eventually we did go back, on Saturday afternoon, as was the habit. When we arrived, I made a beeline for my grandmother, and more importantly, the knitting. She began to teach me again, a basic knit stitch. In through the front door, run around the back, peek through the window, and off jumped Jack. I was slow and hesitant, frequently dropping stitches or having new ones appear out of thin air. Gradually, visit after visit, my scarf began to take shape. It was late summer when I started, and by mid-autumn my grandmother deemed it long enough to teach me how to cast off. My first ever scarf was finally off the needles, the loose threads carefully woven into the fabric by my grandmother. It was ready to wear. I held it in my hands, gentle as I could, as if this uneven rectangle of acrylic fibers was a newborn baby. Far from the neat and beautiful things that my grandmother would make, this thing was lumpy and full of holes. Some stitches hung huge and loose. Others were pulled so tight that they disappeared into the fabric. Long ladders ran down where I had dropped stitches and not noticed. It was ugly, of course, hideous when I look back at the photos. We were well into May by the time I allowed my mother to pry it from me, as I once again tried to leave for school with it wrapped around my neck. The threat of overheating seeming entirely inconsequential compared to the horrors of not getting to wear the scarf I had made all by myself. You will forgive my rambling. I never could stand to be watched in silence. After all, aren't wool and storytelling as old a pair as the day and night? For as long as people have gathered to create, they have told each other stories as they did so. To spin a yarn, if you like. My grandmother would tell me stories as we knit together. All the superstitions of the craft that we were sharing. She told me how I should never knit a jumper for a boyfriend because that would curse the relationship to end. But that I should cast one on as soon as he was my husband because that would keep him with me forever. She told me how her wedding gift to my grandfather was a bag of wool to knit him a Guernsey like the fishermen of Musselburgh had been wearing for as long as she could tell. With a wink, she would lean in to tell me in a hushed stage whisper how she had knit a strand of her own hair into it to make the spell extra strong. He still had that Guernsey. He would bring it out to show me every time my grandmother told that story. By now, it was more darned patches than original jumper, made far too delicate from long years of use to be worn still, but all the more precious for it. My grandmother would trace its patterns with her nimble fingers. Each motif, as she told it, was a charm. The cross lines, a net to ensure bounty. The cables, ropes for safety and security. Diamonds for wealth. The pattern, a spell, handed down from person to person, scribbled on scrap paper if it was written down at all. Made real with love and magic, one stitch at a time. As the years have passed me by in this forgotten place, the line between witch and bewitched has blurred and merged. I wielded its magic and found myself ensnared. The spirits found the boy, and they saw his work. They saw intricate lace and hardy jumpers, thick socks to keep out the winter chill, and light shawls to fend off the summer sun. And in each, not a stitch was out of place. They were enraged, for it is the role of spirits to be perfect, and the role of mortals to be flawed. That was the way of things. That was the agreement for as long as there had been spirits and mortals. And worse still was the boy, sat quietly by the fire, finishing one thing and looking over it with dissatisfied eyes before carelessly tossing it aside and beginning the next. As far as he saw it, he followed his patterns. He made them correctly, but nothing more. He had his patterns, and he followed them to the letter. His stitches neat, his techniques precise. But all his creations turned lifeless as they left his needles. All the love he held for his craft vanished like a dream into the uniformity of his stitches. It was an insult to the spirits, one that could not go ignored. It was another scarf, after the first. This time knit ribbed so that I could practice my pearls in a yarn of rich jewel tones that faded from one color to the next as I worked. The ridges and valleys of the pattern helped to hide the mistakes I'm sure still littered the thing. By now, I was able to take it home with me between visits, and I would work on it long into the night, hastily shoving it under the covers and feigning sleep whenever my mother would come to check on me. A ruse I'm sure never truly fooled her, but I think she was glad to see me so engrossed in something, to see the bond that it was forming between my grandmother and me, so she let it slide. As the weeks turned into months, turned into years, my love for the craft only grew. I was determined to master it, trying out each new technique that I heard of to try and grow my skills, with anything that didn't fit my personal style gifted away. Few friends or family members managed to escape knowing me without at least a hat to show for it. The spirits devised a plan. In the form of a summer breeze, they whispered to him stories of the creatures, of the beautiful things made by creatures of magic and lore, of a cloak woven by fairy hands to be as light as air, warm as a lover's kiss, of the night it kept warm as he crossed a frozen desert in search of his beloved. Oh, said the boy, how I would love to feel such a thing soft around my shoulders, appearing as the pattering of rain on the window. They told him of a crown worked in wire thin as spider silk, whose designs were so intricate they required a magnifying glass in order to be properly appreciated. How it would give clarity to those with pure intention and curse those unfit for rule. Oh, said the boy, how I would love to examine such craftsmanship, to see it glitter in the sun. A spirit in the shape flickering candlelight told of a cloth embroidered with magic thread that shimmered and danced according to the whims and desires of its wearer, of the brave young hero who bore it to whom it warned of danger. Oh, said the boy, how I would love to see how such beautiful things were made. The boy was entranced by these tales, picturing the wonders in his mind, yearning to reach out and touch them outside of the limits of his own imagination. A spirit in the form of a solitary ray of moonlight flowing in through his windows told the boy of a yarn, of a golden thread of such impossible softness, of such strength, how the things worked in it shone, how if it was handled by a maker with enough skill and love for their craft, it would go on forever, spinning itself out of the passion in their very soul. How it could only produce perfection. Please, the boy begged the spirits then, show me where I might find some of this yarn. I can imagine nothing I would want so much as to work with it. We do not usually share such a thing with mortals, said the spirits with a feigned hesitancy. They have not the skill to use such a fine material properly. But I do, said the boy, offering up some of his own work for the spirit's inspection. I work hard day and night. I aim for perfection, and I know with this yarn I could reach it. If I could just knit with it, I know there is nothing else I would want to do. There was a flash in the moonlight spirit, like the flash in the eyes of a predator. Do you promise? Said the spirits. Do you swear that it is all you would want to do? I do, said the boy. I swear it. One thing my grandmother always disapproved of was my love of accuracy. I was meticulous in fixing my mistakes, even if it meant ripping back hours or days of works. To me, there was no greater satisfaction than binding off a project, examining it with a forensic closeness, and being able to proudly declare that every stitch was in its place. To which my grandmother, if she was within earshot, would roll her eyes, tell me that it was bad luck, that if she wanted something knit with a sterile precision, she would buy it on the high street. To her, there was no compliment more backhanded than somebody admiring her work with the phrase, "It looks like something bought from the shops." To her, she had no interest in laboring over something for dozens of hours simply to imitate a machine. But to me, it was like a challenge. The same kind of satisfaction I saw in my friends when they played a game with a perfect score. The spirits led the boy into the woods. to a cabin nestled comfortably between a mossy rock face and a stream. Inside, he found a fire crackling happily in the fireplace, a rocking chair and small table in its warm glow. And there, sat upon the table, was a ball of the most glorious yarn he had ever seen, soft, golden, and pierced through with 2 wooden needles. It shone slightly in the flickering light of the fire. The boy sat, ran the ends reverently through his fingers, and began to cast on. It was only hours later that he would realize his mistake, that to the spirits every word is a promise. He had told them if he could just knit with that yarn, there is nothing else he would want to do. And so from then until forever, the boy knit on. She passed when I was 20. It doesn't matter what. One day she was in her chair, knitting a pair of mittens for her neighbor's grandson, and the next it was empty. Her needles lying still on the arm, half an inch of mitten cuff, never to be finished. At some point between that day and the funeral, I was presented with a cardboard box containing every jumper she had ever knit for herself and tasked with choosing which she would be wearing when we buried her. It was a smaller box than I had imagined. Always knitting, and yet so little of it was for herself. I had never really realized, and the guilt over the shockingly few things that I had made for her tugged sharply at my stomach. Gentle as I could, like it would crumble to dust in my fingers, I lifted the first out of that dented cardboard. A jumper, traditional Fair Isle motifs in cream and tan and blue. It was neat and intricate, an excellent example of her technical skills. I brushed my fingers over the stripes of starbursts and XOs. But as I did, I began to notice an irregularity. Moments where the design seemed ever so slightly off. Looking closer, I could see the spots where she must have miscounted, causing the design to jump ever so slightly. Invisible to most, but I could see it. As could she, I was sure. I could only remember a small handful of times I had seen her in that jumper, and I realized she mustn't have been satisfied. But there wasn't a chance in hell I would let her be laid to rest in anything but her best work. The Fair Isle jumper was put to the side. Next out was a cardigan in fussy green mohair, the wispy fibre casting a halo when held up to the light. A pattern of lace spread gently from the neck edge and over the shoulders, the haze of the yarn helping to soften the exacting precision of the design, softening it almost enough for me to notice where the design stuttered, a hole in the fabric where there shouldn't be, a glaring error as soon as I saw it. I began to tear through the box, examining each item in turn with the kind of critical gaze I never in a million years thought I would turn to my grandmother's work. Jumper after jumper piled on the floor. This one's cuff had a knit where a pearl should be, ruining the otherwise neat ribbing. That one had an errant increase in the body that was fixed with an out-of-place decrease half a dozen rows later. Not a single one was right. Every error betraying my grandmother, stamping her years of practice and expertise into the mud. Every single one was ruined. None of them were the quality I knew she was capable of. None of them were good enough for her to be wearing when I had to fix it. Of course I did. I had to take one and fix it and make it right, to make it right. I plucked one from the floor, the one with the cuff all wrong. If I could undo the edge and drop one stitch down, just enough to fix the one that was wrong, I could do that. I had done that before on my own work. All it would take was a little care and a crochet hook. I undid the edge, ever so gently, teasing out the woven-in end as best I could, catching the stitches on a needle as they came free. I held my breath, so close to fixing it. Something snapped, a weakness in a stitch or the yarn, I wasn't quite sure, but all of a sudden a hole opened up in the fabric, and everything my trembling hands did to try and stem the damage seemed to only open it further. I was seized with a rage that hit sudden and hard, a blinding hot anger at her for leaving me to deal with this, to pick which mistake I would have to see her in last. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cut and tear and rip and burn until every single one of them was gone. And I was freed from the crushing decision I had to make. The urge to move and destroy was so all-encompassing that I could only fight it by forcing myself into absolute stillness. The fabric clenched tight in my fists, the tips of the needles digging sharply into my palm. The pain grounded me, gave me a spot that felt real amongst all this roaring haze. I squeezed my hand tighter, wanting to hold on to that last spot, that last piece of reality as the world seemed to fall away. The slightest pop as the tip of the needle broke skin. A stain spread across the sleeve of the jumper. Blood red appearing black on the navy wool. Ruined for good. As fast as the anger had hit, it was replaced with a heavy numbness. Fingers that didn't quite feel my own shook as they opened, sending the bloody jumper and needles tumbling to the floor. The world swam as I stood, the world around me seeming distant and strange. One thought in my mind: if I couldn't fix her work, then I could make my own. And I would make it right. I would make it perfect. I locked the door to my room. The idea of somebody interrupting me and breaking my concentration felt abhorrent. Like the slightest intrusion would lead to yet another ruined thing. I dug in my basket, found the yarn, the beautiful cream of undyed wool. I didn't even see where my hands left bloody spots wherever I touched it. With a singular focus I hadn't known in years, I began to cast on. Hours passed. My hands were cramping and sore, and on I knit. The sun rose, light peeking its way from behind my curtains into the dimness of my room, and on I knit. Knocks at the door went unanswered, and on I knit. The skin of my fingers, where they would push on my needles, wore and cracked. Every stitch digging the tip deeper under the skin, pulling back for just long enough to allow a bead of blood to form, before the next stitch came stabbing in again. Never enough time for them to scab or heal. I could, I suppose, have worked around it. Altered my technique slightly to protect my damaged fingers. Stopping entirely was out of the question. But to do so would have compromised speed. Would have jolted me out of my well-practiced rhythm. The yarn came up to my fingers in its pristine cream and left it dotted with red that, as it dried, would turn a crusty, muddy brown. My ball of yarn grew smaller and smaller, and I watched its inevitable end with a growing anxiety. If this one ran out, then I would need to stop. I would need to find another, and I would need to join it to my work. And I would risk the myriad ways that can go wrong, the line that change can leave. the way it can alter my tension or color and leave this to a ruined mess. This fear grew and solidified inside me, a jagged, crystalline thing that cut with every movement and breath, with every inch of yarn that dragged its way over my worn fingers. A pain tugged its way down my arm, a string of sandpaper dragging itself through my veins. A prickling numbness right at my core, as miraculously I stopped pulling from the ball of yarn that had long since fallen at my feet. Instead, I was pulling from something that spun itself from deep inside me, something ripped from a hole never meant to be broken. I must have known then how wrong it all was. Must have known on some level this was not something that should be happening, but if it did, it wasn't something I let myself think about. But then it was exhilarating, agonizing, yes, but at the same time, I saw the fabric flow from my needles, neat and orderly and perfect. Even devoid of the showy techniques and motifs I was so fond of, I knew this was the most perfect my knitting had ever been. I knew that so long as I kept going, kept letting it siphon off whatever essential thing of mine it was using, it would be perfect forever. If I kept going, I wouldn't need to eat or drink or sleep. I could simply make. Time passed. Who knows how much? How many years I have lost to this place. My needles carve deep channels into my fingers. Flash of white bone before they begin to heal over. Raw and tender flesh trying in vain to weave itself back together. Faster than should be possible, but never fast enough. The next stitch always coming in a moment too soon to carve off another piece of me to fall to the floor. My world festers around me. The paint of my walls has peeled. The floorboards are rotten. Damp mold blooms in every corner. And creeping ivy has forced its way in through my windows. Outside, out of sight, the world has fallen silent. My work piles around me, but it is dull and lifeless. Whatever vitality it took from me in its making is tied up so tight in these stitches that it is completely invisible. I should stop. But if I stop, it would just be left here. A pale and faded imitation of what I know it can be. Of the beautiful things I know I can make. That I have made. If I leave, it becomes just another ruined thing. I try to put down my needles. Just for a moment, just to rest. A short moment, but when I do, I am swarmed by 1,000 invisible bugs. Crawling and biting and burrowing at my skin, urging me back to movement. The room spins and my stomach turns with vertigo and shame when I turn myself away from my work. And before too long, the pain of continuing seems the more manageable course, and I am compelled to return. I should stop. I want to stop. I can't. After years, decades, I realized I simply can't stop. That I am lost to the simple beauty in these perfect, uniform stitches. That a part of me dies when that beauty fades. And it fades so fast. scarcely off the needles before its light becomes part of the dull mass. I have to keep going, to keep making what beauty I can, and I am not allowed to consider the cost, to mourn what has been taken from me, to mourn who? I can't. There was a boy. There was a boy, and he was tricked. Long before the spirits, long before the cabin, he was told he could make such beautiful things. He was told. And every word of it was a lie. The spirits were right, that perfection is no place for a mortal, but he was told he could reach it. He was told, and he believed. And the closer he got to it, the further he got from himself. There was a stupid boy, and he believed, and he was tricked. And all he wanted was to make a beautiful thing, to take that golden yarn and work it into something that would bring him joy, to find out what he had lost in his stupid race to perfection. I was 8. I was 8 years old, and sitting on my grandmother's sofa, and in my hands was a newly finished scarf of bright yellow. The first thing I had ever made. And I was crying. The thing in my hands was wrong. It was lumpy and full of holes. Some stitches hung huge and loose. Others were pulled so tight they disappeared into the fabric. Long ladders ran down where I had dropped stitches and not noticed. Even with my child's eyes, I could see the errors and their ugliness. I was inconsolable. My grandmother took it from my hands like it was a precious treasure, wiped my eyes, and had me sit on the arm of her chair while she explained it to me. Here, she said, brushing her fingers over the fabric. See how your stitches start all different sizes, but they even up as you go? This is a timeline of you learning how to tension your yarn. These holes are where you did a yarn over by mistake, and one day you will use these to make the most lovely lace. Where it gets wider and smaller, when you know how to do that on purpose, you'll be able to make things fit you just right. And this, she traced her finger down the ladder of a dropped stitch. This is the best part of all. This is a mistake. It's how you know you made it with your own 2 hands. She wrapped the scarf around me. It's the most beautiful thing I've seen. I think I need to rest now.